Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us on today's webinar. What we're going to look at today is the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, or ESOS, phases 3 and 4, and around some of the changes relating to the carbon reporting requirements, particularly in phase 4. But also on a voluntary basis for phase 3. So I'm Stephen Burt from NQA, and once again, thank you very much for joining me. So what we'll look at, kind of broad overview, a bit of an introduction to myself and to NQA first, and then we'll have a look at the background and the context to ESOS. I'm assuming to some extent that most of you that are on this webinar already know all about ESOS because you are either ESOS lead assessors or are involved, your companies are obligated under ESOS. So we'll spend a bit of time looking at the background and the context, and then we'll have a look at some of the changes that are proposed at the minute for ESOS phase 3 and phase 4. And then we'll look specifically at the newly published draft of the publicly available specification 51215, which is a BSI document focused on energy and net zero assessment, and has been produced as a result of the proposed changes to ESOS for phase 3 and phase 4. And lastly, we'll look at how NQA can help. So we'll crack on. I'll take questions at the end. There's a chat box that hopefully you can all see and hopefully you can all use. And if you've any questions, please enter them into the chat box and we'll chat through them then. I'm imagining the slides will probably take around about 30 minutes or thereabouts to get through. So we should have plenty of time to take any questions at the end. So introduction to myself first, I'm Stephen Burt, I'm the Field Director with NQA Certification. I'm also involved directly in delivering a large number of our sort of environmental and sustainability services. So we try to tie everything into the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So number 13 is climate action. And around that, we offer services around, certification to UCAS accredited certification to various ISO standards, including 14,001 for environmental, 50,001 for energy. We also offer some carbon services around PAS 2060, which is a carbon neutrality specification. ISO 14064, which is the international standard for greenhouse gas quantification and reporting, and a few other smaller ones as well. EcoCampus for universities, ISO 26000 is the social responsibility standard, and ISO 20121 is sustainable event. So my primary role in NQA is as field directors is looking after our auditors, but I also deliver these type of audits myself on a fairly regular basis. Just a bit of background to NQA as well. It's important to point out that we are a UCAS accredited certification body, so we're not consultants. We can't help you with ESOS. We can't, we're not ESOS lead assessors. We're not involved in that side of things at all. But hopefully I'll be able to show you later on how NQA can help around some of the future ESOS requirements with carbon reporting. So NQA is a global certification body. You can see some information there around our market position. We tend to specialise as much as we can in the high technology and the engineering sectors. Head office is in Dunstable, which is just north of London. Company's been around for 34 years or so. All in all, we have 53,000 certificates globally, and very successful, very quick growing certification body. I've been with the company for 15 years or so these days. So that's a UCAS accredited certification body. So a bit of background and context to ESOS first then. So the UK actually has a statutory commitment to be net zero within national boundaries by 2050. So the UK government established that originally via the Climate Change Act in 2008, and then amended it slightly to have the net zero commitment by 2050. Those changes took place in 2019, but all of that is in line with the Paris Agreement of 2015. So the UK have published, the UK government have published their net zero strategy. You can download it and read it. It's about 200 to 300 pages long, but there's lots of interesting information in there about what the strategy will be to move the UK towards net zero. Included in there are various regulatory and policy requirements that already have been or will be introduced or will be amended as time progresses to mandate compliance or improve compliance amongst increasing numbers of organisations in the country. So these include ESOS, the Energy Saving Opportunities Scheme, which is the focus of today's webinar. There are others as well. So, for example, the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting SECR requirements also has a carbon reporting requirement. Climate change agreements, we can see those beginning to be amended to require carbon as well as energy reporting. The UK ETS, the Emission Trading Scheme, which was formerly the EU ETS, but now UK ETS. The thresholds for that will amend over time to capture more and more companies into the mandatory carbon reporting requirements. And we've also seen some, or one example of a procurement policy note for the government, PPNO 621, which requires all companies with contract values in excess of £5 million with the UK government organisations to report on carbon and carbon reduction initiatives. So the net zero strategy over time will introduce and amend these regulatory and policy requirements so that more and more businesses will become obligated to report and manage their carbon and move towards net zero. But that's all part of the government's commitment, the country's commitment to net zero by 2050. I also see in my day-to-day role increased supply chain pressures coming from large companies down through their supply chains around energy, carbon reporting and reduction. And that's as a result of larger organisations pursuing their own net zero commitments. So, a couple of examples I've seen recently came from major OEMs asking their supply chain about their carbon emissions and scope 1, 2 and 3, and asking them to commit to reduction. So we'll see a greening of the supply chains via that mechanism as well. So, as I'm sure most of you, if not all of you know, ESOS is a mandatory energy assessment scheme in the UK. So any what they call large undertakings, and I'll explain that in a second, are required to assess and report their energy usage every 4 years and to identify mechanisms for them to improve their energy efficiency. So the regulation was originally introduced in 2014, and then phase 1 took place over a 4-year period from 2015 to 2019, and that mandated only energy reporting and energy efficiency improvement requirements. Phase 2 similarly took place over a 4-year period, 2019 to 2023. And again, that mandated energy reporting and energy efficiency, or the identification of energy efficiency improvements, not necessarily the implementation of those. And then phase 3, which we're in now, takes place between 2023 to 2027. So the qualification date for phase 3, in other words, at this particular point of time, was your company obligated against these requirements or not, is passed. That was on the 31st of December 2022. and the necessary compliance date. In other words, the date that you have to have completed your ESOS assessment and submitted it and reported it to the regulatory body is coming up quickly. It's 5th of December 2023. So your phase 4 will take place the 4 years after that, so from 2027 to 2031. So your company or organisation, you have to comply. It's a legal obligation to comply with ESOS Phase 3 if on the qualifying date you had more than 250 members of staff or had a turnover of more than £44 million and an annual balance sheet of over £38 million. The government's predicted that will impact around 7,500 or so UK organisations. There's some other criteria if you're an overseas organisation with over 250 employees. So one of the things we can note there is that phase 3, the turnover and the annual balance sheet thresholds are now in GB pounds rather than in euros as they were previously. So if your organisation on the 31st of December 2022 qualified for ESOS, then you have to take a number of steps for compliance. So in summary, you need to gather 12 months worth of verifiable energy data. Most companies do that to a calendar year, some do it to a financial year, but it must be 12 months worth, and to calculate your total energy consumption for the organisation or group. And specifically, that has to be undertaken for buildings, the company buildings or the organisation buildings, the processes that you undertake and the transport as well that you undertake. Using that data and the information that you've gathered, you then need to identify and audit the areas of significant energy consumption and identify where potential energy saving opportunities are available. At the minute, you don't have to implement those. So certainly for phase 2, it was okay to just identify those energy saving opportunities, but that will be strengthened over the coming phases. You also need to appoint what's called an ESOS lead assessor. So there's a particular qualification requirement for that, that, you know, in terms of competencies, but those people, you can find them on the lists from approved professional bodies. So for example, the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment, IEMA, or the Energy Institute, or there are several others as well. So to become an ESOS lead assessor, there's competency requirements, and using the professional body, you register yourself as an ESOS lead assessor. And those individuals are responsible for undertaking and overseeing and reviewing the ESOS assessment, the energy audit itself. Those individuals can be external to the organisation, or they can be internal employees as well, so long as they meet the requirements for an ESOS lead assessor. You then need to notify the Environment Agency, which is the regulatory body for ESOS, that you've completed the assessment and carried it out in accordance with the regulations, and you need to retain records of the whole thing. There is an option to use ISO 50001 certification as a means for compliance with ESOS. So ISO 50001 is the international standard for energy management system requirements. And by achieving certification to that, it's taken as a route to compliance for ESOS. And that's the type of thing that an organisation like NQA, a UCAS accredited certification body, can help with. So some of the proposed changes for phase 3 and phase 4 of ESOS. So last year, 2022, the government began quite a large consultation process, the aim of which was to improve ESOS and amend ESOS so that it assists in moving the UK towards the goal of net zero. So that consultation process is now complete. There isn't, as far as I'm aware, revised guidance for phase 3 yet, although we know what those proposals are, and we know that that revised guidance is on the way shortly. So they've not yet been finalised, but we've got a very, very good idea of what those will look like when they come. Most of the revisions that will take place won't be implemented until phase 4. So that will be 2027 to 2031. The reason for that is because the consultation process took a little longer than planned, and therefore there will be organisations who potentially qualified on the 31st of December 2022 and may already have completed their phase 3 ESOS assessments. So to benefit those organisations and to save them from having to significantly change what they've already done, most of the revisions which will come from that consultation process will take place in phase 4. However, some of them will be implemented ahead or during the phase 3 compliance deadline, and the government will make an amendment to the energy bill to allow that to happen. So in summary, the big consultation process and changes coming, and changes coming now and changes coming later, which will strengthen the move towards net zero. So just to summarise some of the changes for phase 3, so that's the phase that we're currently in. So there will be a requirement for energy efficiency improvement targets and the action plans to achieve those targets to be set after the phase 3 compliance deadline, so 5th of December 2023. With progress then being reported on at phase 4 and onwards. So this is a new change. The need for targets and implementing the actions wasn't a requirement previously, and reporting on progress wasn't a requirement previously. They've also reduced what they call the de minimis exemption. So that was 10%. That will be reduced to up to 5%. So in other words, 95% of the organisation's overall energy use will now need to be accounted for within the ESOS assessment. Previously, that was 90%. It's now 95%. And again, thinking about the buildings, the processes and the transport functions. There'll also be a need to introduce what's called an energy intensity metric. So either and/or kilowatt hours per metre squared, kilowatt hours per unit output, or kilowatt hours per mile travelled for transport. So that addresses the building function, kilowatt hours per metre squared, the process function, kilowatt hours per unit output, and the transport function, kilowatt hours per mile travelled. So those will need to be in the ESOS reports. There'll also be a standardised template to be used for phase 3 that will be produced to allow the compliance information in the ESOS report to be sort of standardised and presented in a standardised format. There's also a requirement to provide the ESOS reports to subsidiary organisations, and the ESOS report will need more detail on the next steps for implementing the recommendations. That will all allow the collection of additional data to allow the regulatory body, the Environment Agency, easier and simpler compliance monitoring and therefore enforcement as well. There's no change to the option to use ISO 50001 as a compliance route. That remains within phase 3 as well. So those are the changes we need to think about. If you've already started your ESOS phase 3 process, keep an eye out for these coming out as formal guidance from the UK government. At the minute, the guidance isn't yet published, but it should be on its way very soon. But we do know that these are going to be in there. So ESOS phase 4, again, the consultation in 2022 gave us some information on what the proposed changes for phase 4 will be. The key one is the net zero element, which will be introduced to ESOS audits. So at the minute, ESOS audits and previously ESOS audits focus on energy only. the net zero element will focus on energy and on carbon emissions. So that will be introduced in phase 4 from 2027 onwards. Those reports for phase 4 need to include an assessment of actions needed to meet future net zero commitments. It's voluntary for phase 3 though. So if you choose to do this in phase 3, then you can do. It will become mandatory from phase 4. So the government have produced a new what's called publicly available specification, a PAS document, which will facilitate that, which we'll look at in a little bit more detail later. That's PAS 51215. There's actually 2 parts to it, -1 and -2. -1 is around the process for energy and net zero assessment. -2 is around the competency requirements for ESOS assessors and lead assessors. So the consultation period, both of those documents were published as working drafts, and the consultation period for those documents finished on Monday this week. So it's quite topical that we're doing this at the minute. They're both available. You can download them if you want to have a look and have a read through them. I've got a little summary later on of what's involved in those. It's also proposed that in phase 4, the thresholds for mandatory participation in ESOS will lower to align it with the streamlined energy and carbon reporting requirements, and that will have the effect of capturing more organisations under ESOS, which is part of the net zero strategy overall for the government. And also there'll be a change for phase 4 that energy saving opportunity recommendations will need to be acted upon. And if you don't achieve them, you'll have to explain why you haven't achieved them. So that's quite a radical change to the ESOS requirements as well. ESOS audits will be required to follow an existing audit standard. So ISO 50002 tells us how to do an energy audit, as does a standard called EN 16247. And another important change is that the previous route to compliance via display energy certificates and green deal assessments, those will be removed for phase 4. However, ISO 50001 certification will remain, as far as we know at the minute, as a compliance route, although there will be additional, because ISO 50001 is an energy management system standard, there will be additional requirements around the carbon side of things. So the net zero side of things will also need to be included by phase 4 as well. So the government, part of the consultation, they've allowed organisations the option to include these changes in phase 3 if you, as a obligated organisation, wish to do so. They'll become mandatory from phase 4 onwards, though. So moving on and looking at the publicly available specification documents that have been produced. So PAS 51215, Energy and Net Zero Assessments is the title. So currently they're in draft, but they've been produced primarily to facilitate the proposed changes to ESOS. So they specify requirements for the actual conduct of the energy and net zero assessment, in other words, how it's undertaken and who undertakes it and so on, as well as the outputs of such an of the ESOS assessment as well. They're intended for use by the energy assessors, energy consultants, energy service providers, as well as the ESOS assessors themselves, to ensure that the ESOS assessments cover both energy and net zero. They'll provide a consistent way for the ESOS lead assessors to undertake the assessments, and they also specify the competency needs of those ESOS lead assessors to be able to conduct or to sign off the assessments themselves. And as I mentioned earlier, they come in 2 parts. Part 1 is the process, the specification for the process of conducting an energy and net zero assessment. And part 2 is the specification for the competencies of the lead assessors and the assessment teams who undertake the energy and net zero assessments. So 2 really useful, I think, documents to be produced. And ultimately those 2 documents can only improve the ESOS process and the move towards net zero that will be mandated under ESOS in the future. So some of the key information in those PAS documents, so PAS 51215. So they're not particularly lengthy documents, but we can pull some elements of key information from those. So number 1, the ESOS assessment is intended to take the approach of comparing your current energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions with where you need to be in a state of net zero by 2050, and for planning objectives to achieve that. So the objectives, that it's kind of implied in the documents that the objectives would be best if you used science-based targets. So science-based targets, as I'm sure many of you know, are intended to allow an organisation to set an end goal target and interim targets to get there, which are focused on capping climate change to 1.5 degrees above the base level, which is where it's been agreed that it needs to be capped to prevent any significant problems from ongoing climate change and global warming. So really need to be setting objectives for energy and therefore greenhouse gas emissions, to be using science-based targets to start to target those objectives, and to provide interim reporting around the progress that you're making towards those targets. So that's a key part of PAS 51215. It also specifies, so number 2, it also specifies that the greenhouse gas emissions that we include and report upon must include all of your scope 1 and your scope 2 greenhouse gas emissions within the control or influence of the organisation. So scope 1 are your direct emissions, so that might be, for example, the combustion of natural gas, the combustion of transport fuel at your site or on your vehicles on the road. So scope 1 emissions, direct emissions that take place as a result of the organisation's direct activities themselves. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions relating to primarily the supply of electricity, which is generated elsewhere and but consumed on your site, and any purchased heat, steam or cooling would come under those scope 2 indirect emissions as well. So most of you, I guess, were under SECR requirements, the streamlined energy and carbon reporting requirements, already quantify your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions to be included in your annual directors reports. However, one of the key changes is that it's also the PAS documents also require the inclusion and the reporting of a limited number of scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions. So scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions are upstream and downstream indirect greenhouse gas emissions which take place as a result of your activities, take place elsewhere. What the PAS document, PAS 51215, limits those to is reporting on business travel, greenhouse gas emissions, but specifically excluding any employee commuting that takes place, and it requires you to report on hotel stays due to business travel. So that's quite limited. The scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions, it's limited overall compared to what I would be used to seeing when doing ISO 14064 verifications or PAS 2060 verifications, those types of things. Usually include all of the upstream and downstream activities. So it's relatively limited, the scope 3 that we'll need to report under ESOS via PAS 51215. I've included there the PAS 51215 definition of net zero, and also the definition of absolute zero as well. So it's worth just dwelling on that for a second. Net zero, the state in which the greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere associated with an organisation's activities it has control over are balanced by the greenhouse gas removals from the atmosphere. And I've also included the diagram that I'm sure we're all used to from the greenhouse gas protocol, which allows us really quite neatly and succinctly to picture scope 1, scope 2 and scope 3 emissions on our heads and have a think about what those are and what they mean. So those two changes are key ones within, those two specifications requirements are key ones within the PAS document. The other ones, number 3, 12-month base year for comparison purposes needs to be established so that we can demonstrate improvement, or at least gauge if improvement's taking place in both energy and greenhouse gas energy efficiency and greenhouse gas emission reductions. The base year can be financial, it can be calendar, it can be whatever you choose it to be, but it has to be a 12-month base year. The PAS document also requires the risks around achieving net zero to be identified, and it provides, there's a nice little table at the back which provides a correspondence or cross-reference between the requirements of ISO 50001 and the PAS document itself, PAS 51215. So that's intended, I think, to enable ISO 50001 to be to continue to be a route to compliance for ESOS, whilst also at the additional need to account for the net zero requirement. PAS 51215 also provides an example structure and contents for the ESOS assessment report. I haven't worked out if that is intended to be the template that's proposed from the consultation process for the assessment reports. I guess so, but the PAS documents, the consultation on those only finished on Monday this week, so we don't quite know what the output from that will be yet, but it does provide us with an example structure and content for the ESOS reports in the future, which includes carbon reporting and net zero, of course. And as I mentioned earlier, PAS 51215-2 defines the competency requirements for the ESOS assessors and the lead assessors, and it also defines what's needed competency-wise to gain and maintain the status of being a lead ESOS assessor as well. So some key changes or some key overview of the requirements within PAS 51215 there. So how can NQA help with all of this? As I mentioned earlier on, we're not a consultancy, we don't offer consultancy, we're purely a certification body. But obviously we offer ISO 50001 certification services, the energy management system standard. That remains in phase 3 and in phase 4, a route to ESOS compliance. So that may suit some businesses to use that as the mechanism to do so. And if that was the case, we'd be more than happy to help you with that. We also offer ISO 14064-1 and actually -2 verification services as well. So ISO 14064 is a standard for quantifying and reporting carbon emissions for organizations and also for projects as well. So we offer that as a service. That may be of interest to you if you're going to, for ESOS purposes, quantify your carbon emissions for scope 1, 2 and the limited number of scope 3, then you may wish to have that independently verified by an organisation like NQA. You may also be experiencing other regulatory like UK ETS or other supply chain drivers asking you to have your greenhouse gas inventory, in other words your carbon calculations, independently verified, and we can do that under our ISO 14064 services. We're also offer PAS 2060, which is a carbon neutrality standard, currently the only sort of internationally recognized carbon neutrality standard. There is an ISO coming along in a couple of years, ISO 14068, which will serve the same purpose. But for the minute, PAS 2060 is the carbon neutrality standard, which NQA under our UCAS accreditation can verify you against. So again, for ESOS purposes, if you've gone as far as quantifying your scope 1, scope 2 and part of your scope 3, you may wish, after you have taken action to reduce those emissions, you may wish to offset your residual greenhouse gas emissions and therefore make a claim to be in a state of carbon neutrality. To do that, you would need to use PAS 2060, and we at NQ are able to provide verification services around that as well, which obviously helps with credibility and you know, avoids greenwashing and keeps the whole thing robust. I've included a link there to our sustainability microsite, which has got loads of information. There's guides on there that you can download for 50001, 14064 and PAS 2060. There's tools that you can download and use from there as well. If you need a consultant to help you with any of this, we've also got you know, partner consultants that we work with. Will provide you with 3 names and you can choose whichever one you wish from those. So good. Hopefully that's given you an overview then of where we are with ESOS, what the outputs from the recent consultation process for ESOS Phase 3 and Phase 4 are, and allows you to tee yourself up for the changes that will come once the guidance is published. And it also hopefully has given you an overview of the PAS standard, which is not finalised, but gives you an idea of what's in there and what the future requirements around the net zero reporting piece of ESOS will look like, and hopefully gives you an overview as well of how NQA might be able to help with the process. So thank you very much indeed for listening. I'll have a look at some of the questions now, if I can remember how to do it. Okay, so so there's a question: if a company has ISO 50001 certification, does a company still have to appoint an ESOS lead assessor? No, you don't. You can send in your ISO 50001 certificate as evidence of ESOS compliance. Sorry, I'm just struggling with the questions slightly here. I'm struggling to pull them out, is what I mean, so that I can see them all clearly. Ah, okay, I'm pushing the wrong button. I've got them now. Sorry about that. We've also got a question from Rob. For the Phase 3 changes, would these have to be applied retrospectively to an obligated company's ESOS energy audit if they've completed this before the changes are formally updated in legislation and enforced? That was part of the consultation process, and the view was yes, if you've already undertaken your ESOS assessment prior to the Phase 3 changes being formally introduced, then the indication is that the Environment Agency would require you to go back and make those mandated Phase 3 changes in your ESOS assessment before you submit them. Mark's asked the question: we have a client with a turnover less than £44 million that's just been purchased by a large company that now solely owns them. Will their energy usage need to be assessed and added to the ESOS assessment of the new owner? I don't know the answer to that. It's that there's quite a bit within there that could depend on what the answer is, Mark. So yeah, there's a few variables there, I think. Paul's asked a question to clarify: when do the scope 3 changes start to apply? So it's from Phase 4. So not this phase, but the next phase in 2027. Although you can do it on a voluntary basis for phase 3 if you wish to do so. But just to be clear, it won't be, as far as the information that we currently have, it won't be mandated until phase 4. Mike's asked, where can we get emission factors for scope 3s? So those are available from the UK government conversion factors. So I work with organisations all over the world on carbon verifications, and in my experience, there's nothing better that I've ever seen, even in what you might consider very advanced countries like Sweden and Norway and the Netherlands and the United States. The UK government do a fantastic job of providing us with conversion factors for scope 1, 2 and 3, and pretty much every conversion factor you could ever need is available via, if you just type in to an internet search engine, UK government carbon conversion factors, you'll get an Excel spreadsheet that way, which they update every year as the power mix changes. So you've always got a current and correct conversion factor to use for that. Anya is asking, do NQA provide services for PAS 2080? Not currently, we don't. But I'd be happy to discuss your needs if you have some. Catherine is asking, can you confirm if NQA or UCAS accredited yet to audit against ISO 14064? So we participated in the pilot project for PAS 2060 for UCAS accreditation. Until that pilot is complete, we cannot extend our current accreditation for PAS 2060 to incorporate ISO 14064. So the answer is no, because we are having to wait for UCAS to finish the pilot project before we can extend that accreditation, unfortunately. We do offer the service now, but at the minute the ISO 14064 service is unaccredited, but it will be accredited, we hope, very soon. Dave Smith asked, if a UK-based organisation has operations outside of the UK, will the operations also fall under the ESOS requirements? Not if it's overseas, no, it's just within the UK. Peter's asked, does the 5% de minimis apply to the current phase of ESOS? The de minimis will change. Just let me remind myself here. Was it phase 4, I think, isn't it? No, phase 3. Yeah. So the de minimis changes for phase 3. It's not formal yet because the government haven't produced a guidance, but we know from the outputs from the consultation process that de minimis will change from 10, sorry, to 5% for phase 3. So we can await the government confirmation on that, but it's an output of the consultation process, so we can be almost certain that that will be the case for the current phase. Good, thank you for the feedback, Adam. Thank you for the feedback, Paul, as well. And that completes the question. So I don't know if anybody else has any questions. We've got a few more minutes if anybody does. Good, so just a few thank yous. So you're welcome, everybody. I hope that's been useful. I have left my email address at the end of here, if that's of any, if anybody needs any further information or copies of the slides, that sort of thing. And here you will also find a link to the sustainability, the NQA sustainability website, which is packed with guides and checklists and tools and all that sort of thing, which will help you with ISO 50001, 14064 and PAS 2060. It won't help you with ESOS. As I said, that's not something that we're involved with, but if you need a consultant, then you can look around for those. Good. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. Happy Friday. Hope you all have a lovely weekend, and thank you very much indeed for attending. Cheers. Bye-bye.